Morning and welcome to China's DeepSeek Moments by the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis. I am Lizzi Li, a fellow here at CCA. Today's discussion is about the latest from China's tech scene over the past several months, actually. All three of our panelists were on the ground in China at the Shanghai World AI Conference and the Robotics Expo, et cetera, et cetera. And they were talking with engineers, the tech community, investors, and also policy community. So what's actually happening on the ground? We'll look at whether China's chip stack GPU stack is meaningfully chipping away at NVIDIA's dominance and what's actually commercializing in robotics in BCI, and which AI trends, whether it's multimodality, AI safety, is gaining traction, and what applications and products are moving from demo to actual deployment and commercialization. Three terrific guests joining me today. We have Rui Ma, CEO at AlphaWatch. We have Paul Triolo, Honorary Senior Fellow here at CCA, and Selina Xu, China and AI Research Lead in the Office of Eric Schmidt. Thank you so much for being here.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Ray, I'm gonna start with you. Why don't you start us off with what the investor and entrepreneur community is saying? What are your new findings when you're on the ground in China?
Sure. Yeah. So I think I mentioned this in many conversations about the trip we just did. And one of the main takeaways is that robotics is a much bigger focus as one of the aspects of intelligence in China versus the Silicon Valley. So if you talk to investors there, first of all, taking a step back, I think depending on which type of investor you're talking to, you're going to get very different sentiments, right? So in the past 5 years or so, there has been a notable shift to more deep tech investing that requires a lot more engineering, know-how, and it's much less distribution focused, much less business model focused. Because you're making bets on emerging technologies. So you see investors who have adjusted their strategies accordingly um, do much better or fare much better versus the ones who are still much more, have not shifted with the times and have remained kind of, I don't want to use the word stuck, but a little bit more still focused on internet or consumer software. Um, with the investors who did make that shift, however, they're finding that they have to have different capital sources. Sometimes it is kind of a requirement by the government, right? If you want to invest in semiconductors, you probably should have all exclusively Chinese capital. Other times it's kind of dictated by the capital market options exits because many of these companies are not looking at overseas capital markets as exits, but domestic ones, in which case it is also much more convenient. And there's some options now you can do, but in the past, it was actually also only available to RMB, basically. And that, depending on who you talk to, could have been a headache more so than they maybe anticipated because RMB limited partners, so the investors who invest in these venture capital funds, are sometimes less sophisticated, but oftentimes they also have just different goals and time horizons. So the investors if you talk to in China who have, raised lots of money from local domestic sources, uh, and have adjusted their strategies, are actually doing fine, I would say. They're fairly optimistic. It's much better than last year, in terms of overall economic sentiment. But the investors who still are heavily reliant on US dollars, particularly from stateside limited partners, and who haven't fully made maybe the pivot to more deep tech, I think are struggling and are wondering what's next, and are largely focused on just managing their portfolios and having good outcome of existing investments versus doing too much in new things. That's sort of like the multi-year overlook. And then the more recently, however, as I was saying, there's this sort of surge in interest in robotics. Many investors have reflected to me that they feel like there's a bubble now because of this interest. And partly it's because the technology is so new that there's very little real utilization, right? Specifically in humanoids, which was one of the highlights of the conference and which has captured sort of the public's imagination and has kind of taken on a life of its own, quite detached from, the realities of commercialization. Because no matter how you slice it, um, the tens of millions, well, now hundreds of millions of dollars going into these humanoid robotic companies, many of which were set up in the last 2 years. The total deployment in China this year is probably the most optimistic estimate I saw was 30,000 units. So that's across the entire industry. And we're seeing many, many companies being valued at hundreds of millions from the get-go and getting, a 30, 50, even $100 million sort of seed round. Now that's still not a ton compared to some of the AI valuations you see here in Silicon Valley, but it is certainly a market departure from what was available even just last year or even at the beginning of this year. So,
Fantastic. And Paul, I'm gonna come to you next for the chips race between US and China. How do you think China's AI stack has evolved since you last visited? What are some of the surprising findings, if any, you had during your visit to China?
Thanks, Lizzie. Great to be here. Yeah, this issue, of course, is almost the stuff of day-to-day day-to-day speculation. Today we had some Chinese semiconductor stocks jump because of a hint that DeepSeek dropped in its blog about its latest incremental model upgrade. So we can talk about that too. So look, I mean, the compute challenge here in China. And we found this talking to all the companies, during the tour we did and around the World AI Conference in Shanghai is a complicated sort of a set of issues. We're in sort of this weird transition period where the domestic players, for example, in China, the domestic model developers, the big players still have access to a lot of, fairly robust GPUs, for example, that they acquired over the last 2 years from NVIDIA and AMD, lesser degree Intel. And so their basic thinking is, they're good for the next year and a half. And then there's a sort of a big question mark as to what happens after that, right? So one of the things, interestingly, we saw at the World AI Conference as we toured the floor was you had both Huawei there, right? The displaying for the first time its massive Cloud Matrix 384 system. I got a great picture of me in front of it, along with others in the group. And I talked to a lot of the engineers there, and they have this big, they're using some optical connectivity for the GPUs, which is pretty novel. But basically, when we talk to some of the players there, the problem is still that Huawei's hardware is still really not not equivalent to or not as good as NVIDIA's, and then the software environment, the development environment around it, obviously is still not also. So Chinese developers are just, it's not surprising. They've been trained on NVIDIA's hardware and software, and it's very good. And it's, it took NVIDIA 20 years to get there. So Huawei is pretty new to the game here. So it's not surprising. But one thing we heard, for example, is that there's a big hope that Huawei is redesigning for example, its Ascend processors, which were not traditional GPUs, general purpose GPUs, which is what NVIDIA is fielding. And so Huawei is redesigning that Ascend processor, which was just a neural processing unit, NPU, which was part of a broader processor, but wasn't really dedicated for AI. They're redesigning that. And so the 910D or the 920 that comes out next year will likely be a much more capable GPU. Of course, all of these things are subject to limitations in terms of manufacturing, which we can talk about. But the Chinese companies are hoping for an alternative, right? It's not that right now they don't like Huawei. They don't like the quality of the alternative, but they obviously, under continued U.S. constraints, which we'll get to in a minute, that have changed. Everybody wants an alternative. The other interesting thing we saw there at the WAIC are these smaller companies. There are many in China. There's companies like MetaX, Softgo, Inflame, More Threads, BREN, CameraCon. They were all there. And those are all very capable companies too. They're small design fabless companies that all have very good GPU designs. But of course, many of them are on the U.S. entity list, the U.S. Commerce Department entity list. So they can't, for example, use Taiwan and TSMC to manufacture their advanced designs. And so, those companies are also then, for example, vying for some of the capacity at domestic foundry leader SMIC to be able to manufacture their designs. But you see, I think today the CameraCon stock jumped because of this idea that DeepSeek had dropped this hint about a certain floating point capability that suggested that it's going to be compatible with domestic hardware going forward, including offerings from companies like CameraCon. So there's sort of the Huawei thing out there, which is complicated, and they're improving all the time, but it's slow, and it's not just hardware, it's software. And then these other smaller players, we saw them at the conference. All the companies were saying, our hardware layer. So there were a lot of interesting companies there, like Infinigence, which I'm going to profile in the Substack coming out today. They're these sort of tier 2 cloud providers that are all using a sort of heterogeneous hardware base. So that's the other thing that's important to note here, is that because of the export controls, in the West, we basically have AMD and NVIDIA. Nobody is using, there are smaller players like Cerebras and a few other companies that are specializing in things like inference. But basically, it's just 2 or 3 players. In China, it's all the Western players plus all the Chinese players, right? So all the companies we talk to, a lot of them like Infinigence and Silicon Flow, which is another company, they all are advertising that they have this sort of heterogeneous hardware base, and they have a lot of middleware to help the developers not have to worry about the sort of what hardware they're operating on. And that can work in some cases, but it's not as easy as it sounds. So in any case, also at the WIC, we saw companies like Infinigence also sort of showing off their capabilities, and those are important because they're really targeting, for example, small and medium-sized enterprises. So the big cloud guys like Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, ByteDance, they have sufficient amounts of compute, both for training and inference. But the big issue, and a lot of the really great companies we saw with Ray were smaller and medium-sized players, right? And so those companies don't have their own capabilities. They're going to have to go either, if they're model developers or application developers, will have to go to elsewhere to get that compute. And so companies like Infinigence and others are some of the companies that are providing that, and they have this very complicated sort of heterogeneous hardware base. So anyway, so that's the main thing. The other part that I profile this in my Substack today is Shanghai in general is really pushing to become a big sort of major hub for all this development. So we saw, of course, we met with a lot of companies in Shanghai and in Hangzhou, but I think Shanghai has really made a push. That's where the World AI Conference is. A lot of companies are setting up headquarters there. There's a whole new complex in Puxi, for example, that's been set up there as an incubator. It's called the Shanghai Model Development Center or Gen AI Development Center. So Shanghai is making a big push for all this, and there's some major players in Shanghai, like Shanghai AI Lab also, which is a big player here, and they're all looking at these things like distributed computing and things like distributed training to help overcome some of the hardware problems. So anyway, so the hardware space is complicated in China because of U.S. controls and because of the domestic market there. But again, that hasn't impacted, I think, the uptake of AI more generally by some of the really amazing companies we saw there, small, medium-sized companies. So right now, it's all engines going, and we were very impressed by a lot of the companies we saw and how they were using AI across their business models, and they were all using either the major cloud providers or some of these second-tier players.
Fantastic. And Paul, we'll get to some of the media noise surrounding DeepSeek, H20 licensing for fee, and also, the security concerns from both sides later on. But speaking of media noise, we have a recovered journalist here in the room with us, Selina. So Selina, offer that journalistic lens to us. What are some of the concrete observations you have from your time on the ground? Where do you think reality really diverged from the headlines? And your readout on the latest on robotics on BCI, which is all the rage in China's tech community today. What strikes you as noteworthy?
Yeah, thanks for having us. I think echoing what, Murray and Paul have kind of already mentioned, I think the most notable thing was really robotics and how pervasive it was. It was kind of just like center stage. And I think in talking to a lot of researchers, startups, and then also I was at the World AI Conference opening ceremony in the morning and heard Premier Li Qiang's speech. And he was really just pushing, I think, on several fronts. One, beyond just like the LLMs and frontier models, he was talking about embodied intelligence as a new frontier. And you can hear them really wanting to emphasize expanding real world application scenarios for robotics in the next few years. And then secondly, also, I think multimodality was a huge thing in which I think China wants to push on more compared to American AI researchers and frontier labs who are now also, I think, kind of trying to push more into like the image to video generation space. And then I think thirdly, obviously, open source was a big thing. So there was a huge emphasis on open source everywhere that we went to, whoever we talked to. And Li Qiang was also talking very much about how China's going to double down on open source. And there was subsequent official readouts that echoed that point with the release of various action plans. But back to the whole thing about robotics, it's kind of interesting because it kind of lies at an intersection of China's various growth sectors, from manufacturing to its supply chains to kinematics, to how it's using batteries and various all these things together with the talents who are really trying to push forward. How do you make robotics cheap and affordable and get people to use them? And China has had, the whole history of like industrial robotics, and now we're really seeing very cool humanoids everywhere. And I think that was something that really struck all of us at the conference, just how cheap some of these humanoids are compared to Americans' like offerings. And then also, obviously, how these humanoids are already trying to, for instance, do various scenarios like, package sorting, or, stocking convenience store shelves, or like interacting with people as companions or with the elderly. So I think there was really a range of scenarios that were being presented right there. And then I think the last thing would be probably the whole thing about BCI, which is kind of ties into the whole elderly care space, like how exactly, BCI with robotics will kind of feed into China's whole demographic challenge, which basically, touches on how with a shrinking workforce, you'll need more people to kind of take care of the elderly, and robotics and BCI plays into that.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, back to Ray's point about actual application scenarios, I think BCI sort of, sits squarely here. There's a demand, there's a supply, and perhaps we will see something, but we will see. But Paul, back to chips and NVIDIA. I mean, media coverage has been kind of confusing to me, at least. And, let's just take stock, right? Media coverage first suggested that restrictions around the H20 delayed DeepSeek's model release. But this morning we saw that DeepSeek announced its V3 model would run on domestic chips, and that just sent stocks of Cambricon, of SMIC, of Huarong just through the roof. So are those Chinese firms like DeepSeek prepared to rely finally on homegrown hardware? I mean, also, on the US side, lots of controversies surrounding the licensing for fee model around NVIDIA chips. How do you think the role of American firms like NVIDIA and AMD will evolve in the Chinese market?
Not an easy question to answer. So yeah, first of all, I think a lot of the discussion on DeepSeek is really off, right? I think that a lot of people are commenting on DeepSeek. I know in talking to people in China that I often hear people respond when I ask them, like, does this make sense on this latest media report on DeepSeek? And they say, no, that's disinformation. So I think that there's a lot of confusion around DeepSeek. The company is not competing, with a lot of the big players in the same way, like OpenAI and Anthropic, in terms of releasing models. They're playing a different game, right? It's a very small company. They're very interested in the technology and in putting out research and sort of advancing the science, around AI. So they're playing a different game here, right? And so they're also, of course, challenged by access to advanced compute. The CEO, Lian Manfeng, has talked about this. But on the other hand, despite that lack of access, they've been able to put out really good open source models, open weight models, and a lot of research around that, which is really what their game is. So all this anticipation about the release of V4 and R2 models from DeepSeek, I think, is sort of a media creation here. And then the surprise announcement, somewhat surprising, I guess not surprising to those who've been watching this closely, a couple days ago, where they released this incremental version of their V1 base model, 3.1, is important because they're targeting this very much at agentic AI. And so that was actually, I think, more important than some of the other issues that people interpreted around this. And because, agentic AI is a big deal here. And so we heard a lot about that when we were in China. Companies like Manus and others that are putting out, very capable agentic platforms. And that's sort of one of the next waves, along with humanoid embodied intelligence and humanoid robots. Agentic AI is really an important thing here. And so that's I think the thing to focus on with DeepSeek. This idea that they put out this nod to a floating point sort of standard that is enables might enable training on less capable GPUs or inferencing on less capable GPUs is important, but that's sort of generally where the industry is going. And I think DeepSeek is just aligning with that. People read into that a lot about whether this was a hint about the domestic hardware. But again, DeepSeek is not in that kind of game about hinting about the capabilities of domestic hardware, which is a totally separate and complicated topic. And I'm skeptical that DeepSeek had any intention to do that. But nevertheless, the question, as I've noted here about when alternatives to Western GPUs will come about is complicated. And now the H20 thing has been sort of thrown into the mix here, and we have to sort of quickly step back and remember the H20 was designed by NVIDIA to comply with October 2023 export control rules from the Commerce Department that sort of changed the goalposts around performance of GPUs. And of course, NVIDIA, wanting to maintain its market in China and be able to support its many customers in China, naturally was going to do this, right? And so the H20 initially, it's ironic, was not something that Chinese companies were excited about because it was a degraded version of the H200 or the H100, the sort of Hopper series that was export controlled to China. But over time, it became clear that the downgrade of this GPU was really primarily around compute, but not on memory and memory bandwidth. And so it became clear that this was actually quite a good GPU to use for inference, not for training, but for inference. And as inference has become more important, sort of runtime, the runtime actions of these models has become more important, inference has become more important. And so that accounts for the massive purchases last year and early this year of the H20s, probably over 1 million. Were purchased by ByteDance, Alibaba, Tencent, some of the big players, right? So, and then in April, the U.S. decided to, the issue of inference is partly because of DeepSeek, and mostly because of DeepSeek. The idea that inference is important became sort of salient in Washington, and people got excited by the fact that, oh, we better start controlling inference too. And so the H20 became the subject of letters to companies about this. Now, there was never any clear rule that was written about this, about what the new performance threshold that they had to meet was. So what happened was, I think, with all the rare earth discussions, the Chinese controls on rare earths, the issue of the H20 sort of became caught up in the U.S.-China trade talks. I'm coming around to the idea, though, that it was not necessarily sort of a quid pro quo for rare earths, but it also dovetailed with this idea that people like AI crypto czar David Sachs at the White House came up with, and the industry has been arguing, ironically, for a long time, which is you don't want to cut off access to everything from U.S. technology to Chinese companies, because then that will only incentivize Chinese companies to design out and just weed out U.S. technology from their stacks. And so now the argument that Jensen Huang made successfully with David Sachs in the White House with President Trump was, hey, let's sell them this inferior GPU and addict them. Of course, U.S. officials like Howard Lutnick have then come out and said, we're going to addict China to inferior technology, which pissed off a lot of people in China, leading to this sort of backlash in China against the H20. So now we're in this very weird situation where Chinese companies would probably like to buy the H20, but they're being told by their regulators, including the Cyberspace Administration of China, MIT, and NDRC, to there's guidance, nothing mandatory yet, to say, reconsider buying those H20s. Part of that is also coming from this idea that has been discussed in the US over the last 3 months of putting some kind of tracking capability into GPUs or into GPU systems to make sure they're not diverted to Chinese end users. And I think the Cyberspace Administration of China was reacting to that. NDRC and MIT were also, I think, reacting to this idea that let's if the Chinese companies buy more US inferior GPUs, then they'll be less likely to work with Huawei and other companies in China to deploy their GPUs. And so that's the situation we're in now. Now, the complicated thing, lastly, is going forward, the President Trump is talking about a degraded version of the Blackwell architecture. This is crazy for the U.S. president to be talking about semiconductors in such granular detail, but here we are, right? Trump is basically making up U.S. export control policy on the fly as he goes. And he's hinted that if NVIDIA designs this B30A downgraded version, that maybe the US will approve that too. So that also puts Chinese companies in a bit of a bind until they see how good that GPU is. They may want to hold off on buying the H20s. So this week, Jensen and NVIDIA was saying that apparently they put on hold some of the suppliers who would be supplying materials and inputs for the H20 production at TSMC to say, hold back. Initially, they thought they would get a lot of orders. They put in orders, I think, for 300,000. They probably have 700,000 H20s in stock. So they don't really need to manufacture a significant number more. They can still try to sell off those 700,000 that were in stock when they were restricted in April. So probably Chinese companies will still buy a lot of them at the end of the day, and then we'll see what happens going forward here with where U.S. export control policy is with respect to China, because nobody knows, right? We're sort of in uncharted territory here where the president is making this stuff up as he goes, including this 15% tax on the GPUs that NVIDIA may have to pay to export them. But the question going forward is, how does this iterate? Because before it was really an attempt to draw a line, and now we seem to be back in some kind of a sliding scale here, where the U.S. The Commerce Department and the U.S. government will allow GPUs that are not the cutting edge, but that are at some level of degradation, be sold to China, and NVIDIA will be continuing to push for this at the same time as the Chinese government sort of fights rearguard action to continue to have companies at least consider alternatives from domestic sources. So it's a weird world we're in now, and will be for the next couple of months, or
Thank
longer.
you so much. Yeah, and related to policy, Selina, I mean, there's growing discussion about how Washington and Beijing are taking quite different approaches to AI governance. And to me, what's really striking is the discussion on AI safety is notably thin here in the US compared with, China, EU, et cetera, et cetera. So from your vantage point, how is China framing its AI safety approach, and how does it diverge from, say, the United States approach on this issue?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. I think AI safety was one of the 3 main topic areas at WIC, officially in their planned program. So they had a series of events around it. And one of the stars of WIC, I'm sure you guys both heard, was Geoffrey Hinton, along with a whole entourage of top scientists from the West, like Stuart Russell, Gillian Hadfield, and people like that, who are all known to be, extremely strong on AI safety, especially in terms of long-term existential risks. So leading up to the conference, I actually was an observer at the International Dialogue on AI Safety, where these scientists were convening, and they issued like a consensus, a Shanghai consensus on like how important it is basically for the US and China to collaborate on AI safety. And I think this was very much echoed by some of the remarks made by Premier Li, as well as, in his global AI governance action plan. So I think this juxtaposed with, the White House had the whole Trump AI action plan that was released around the same time, that had a significant absence of anything related to AI safety, which generally just aligns with the retreat that the US has had in the past few months with regards to like AI governance and safety globally. So I think for China, it's one way they want to portray themselves as like a global player in AI beyond just development, but also in governance. And then two, I think there is a huge messaging about why this is an area of needed U.S.-China collaboration despite all the competition going around. And then thirdly, with the all these foreign countries that were in participation as like visiting dignitaries at WIC, the whole message was we want to basically help make sure that AI is a global public good that benefits all of you, the global South included, and not just US and China, the two big players. So I think there is like a PR messaging here, but also like a genuine need for collaboration in very practical terms, like joint testing, standards and things like that. So I think China sees like a real need to control this technology and then also to collaborate with the US.
Yeah.
Can I make just a quick, I think those are great comments, and I totally agree with everything Selina said. I was on a closed door panel on safety there with Stuart Russell, who made the point that he had talked to a US AI leading lab, the CEO of a leading lab, who said that the best hope in the next few years was for a Chernobyl style event caused by AI. So yes, there's this sort of weird, there's risks at many different levels. There's sort of the overall existential risk and the risk of sort of some catastrophic event. And then there's the sort of lower level risks around bias and fraud, which the Chinese AI safety community, for example, has been doing a lot of really good work on in the last few years. And then in February, the Chinese officially established their own AI Safety Institute, the China AI Safety and Development Association, which was very much present at the WIC at all the forums that I attended. The interesting thing, though, that I found is, just to add to what Selina said here, is the companies in China now are sort of coming around to the idea that they need to sign on or be sort of aligning over time with some of the best practices coming out of the US and the EU. So in the US, you have these voluntary commitments from the Biden era that have led most of the major AI labs to publish publicly things like responsible scaling policies, which means as the models become more effective, more capable, and capable of doing bad things in the hands of malicious actors like cyber and CBRN, which is weapons, chemical, biological, radiological weapons, that the companies need to test those models to ensure that they don't enable things that would be bad. And so in China, JIRPU signed on to sort of this concept as part of the broader Bletchley Park AI Safety Summit process. And then late last year, CAICT and the AI Industrial Alliance in China came up with their own standards, which were informed by those voluntary commitments. And then at the WIC, 5 more companies signed on to those commitments very publicly. I can't really find anything further on this written, but there was a live streamed thing where the company signed on. And so then in talking to companies in China, some companies, for example, that we met with are considering also signing on to the Code of Practice, which is part of the EU AI Act, which went into effect on August 2nd, just after the WIC. And this is complicated because DeepSeek, for example, is considering signing on. They have their app is in EU app stores. And then companies like Alibaba, may not, and others may not wish right now to sign on to the Code of Practice, which is voluntary, but elements of which will become mandatory in 2 years when the EU AI kicks in fully. So Chinese companies are now caught in this situation where if they want to be global companies, they're going to probably have to consider how to align with some of these best practices around responsible scaling, and then also publishing those policies and publishing details of what they're doing in terms of testing against those policies. That was the subject of my talk at the closed door meeting in Shanghai. And I got a lot of, people were like, obviously people are saying things like, we can't just trust the companies. And so that was the idea of the safety institutes, which was that they would provide this sort of bridge between the government and the companies to ensure that the companies are living up to these, to some of these scaling policies. So I think it's a really complicated situation right now because, as Selina notes, the U.S. has pulled back from this. The U.S. was driving some of this AI safety work, and now the Trump administration has pulled back and is more focused on promoting the U.S. AI stack and its export and building out U.S. AI infrastructure, and not so much on the safety issue, and has renamed the Safety Institute around safety, innovation, and standards. And so this is a complicated issue. So China, I wrote a Substack coming out of this, basically saying China looks like it wants to take the lead here on AI safety globally, and is certainly a more important player. And all the everybody was there in Shanghai, and the EU was there. I was sitting next to somebody from the British Embassy, but the U.S. presence was noticeably absent, both government and company. The only major U.S. lab that was there was XAI sent Dan Hendricks there, who's their AI safety lead. And Dan was great, but he was talking about the need to ban open source models, and he raised a lot of hackles, of course, because in China, open source is viewed as a very good thing. And so in my closed door meeting, some of the Chinese representatives said we have to force the U.S. government to make U.S. labs open source, like OpenAI and Anthropic. And Dan was saying, oh no, we shouldn't be. We should be outlawing open source because we're essentially handing everybody a biological weapons capability if we allow advanced open source models to be distributed. So anyway, so China. Bottom line, I've been exposed a lot over the last 6 months to the Chinese AI safety community, and it's matured quite quickly, and it's very capable, very thoughtful. People like Sung Yi in Beijing, and the Shanghai AI Lab is very impressive. I was sitting next to Zhou Bo-wen, from a former IBM guy who's at the Shanghai AI Lab, and the work they're doing there is really advanced, along with Concordia AI in Beijing. They put out a framework, for example, for advanced frontier models. It was very good. At the event, and on a side panel at the event that I participated in. So China is really thinking really hard about this. And then finally, Premier Li Qiang proposed this World AI Cooperation Organization. Apparently surprising some people in China. It's not clear, what this organization would do, but it showed that, again, sort of the idea that China wants to take the lead in some of these things and be participating in broader global discussions around this at a time when the U.S. is pulling back. And so I think the next 3 to 6 months will be important to determine where this all goes before this next AI summit in Delhi, which will probably take place in February. So, but again, China is on the map. They're doing lots of good work on this, on AI safety. And again, I agree with Selina. Everybody agrees in the safety community that China needs to be part of the discussion here and can't be left out. There's just too many important companies in China that are working in the space. You leave China out, and you're not going to be able to get a global agreement around AI safety.
Fantastic. And, speaking of divergent approach to AI, in addition to safety, in addition to, open source versus closed source, Paul hinted at. Selina, you also touched on this in your recent piece for New York Times, right? US tech giants tend to, pursue those lofty, AI AGI goals, while Chinese firms seems to be much more pragmatic. But speaking of pragmatism, Ray, I'm gonna turn to you. We see a lot of policy signals, right? National goals, blueprint, subsidies, procurement, et cetera, et cetera. But where is commercialization truly happening? And what are the pain points? Are there plausible go-to-market paths, for something like robotics, right, in the next couple of years? What's your take on that?
I think, well, if we were again referring to something very narrow and emerging like humanoids, that is an area that I think multiple investors, and pretty even obvious to myself, that it is overblown. But if we're talking about robotics and AI in general, then I think it is very much alive and well in terms of commercialization in China. In fact, I think like one of the, well, Paul missed this because he was at another event, but we went to a leading VC in China, and they showed us a presentation. I think it was probably adapted from what they show their limited partners, because it was somewhat marketing in nature, but it was also very true, I think, to the reality of startups in China, which is that in terms of robotics in particular, they have much more higher commercialization potential in China because of policy, because of, the fast-moving environment, because so much manufacturing is done there. And you have the fact that like the companies actually have the technology, and their valuations also tend to be much cheaper. So the one stark example they gave was there was this one slide and it showed two kind of identical looking um, car-like things, without windows. So there were basically these autonomous self-driving logistic robots that carry things from warehouse to truck and maybe a few other places, but shorter distances, not for highway use. And there's a company called Neuro in the US that was once upon a time valued at $6 billion. And I'm not sure if they actually ever even made a working prototype, but effectively their sales never materialized. So revenue, zero. $6 billion valuation. And then on the right-hand side, you have something that looks very similar from this one that was invested in by one of the VCs giving this presentation. Um, it is only valued at $600 million, and their Q2, right? So second quarter 2025 revenue was $15 million, and they're being used by the top three largest logistics companies in China in real live operations, right? These are not like pilots. These are actually being commercialized. And there were multiple examples, by the way, of things like that. But this one, I think that really showed, this was one of the starker examples. And that's where I think, aside from the humanoid robots being still very much a little bit sci-fi, all these other things that you see, like service robots, cleaning maintenance robots, like basically inserting all sorts of intelligence into consumer electronics of all sorts, right? There's some people are putting it, I think Medea just put DeepSeek into their air conditioner. I don't know why you need that, but all these things are happening in China, and there's real commercialization. The challenge is much more on the software side, where you are, you just don't see the enterprise willingness to spend at the same dollar values. And this is why, as Selina said, the similar or comparable products in China are discounted by at least, I would say, 70% compared to their US counterparts. And I'm talking about software products from across, like throughout the entire stack. Um, and then you see a lot of companies in China, of course, for security reasons, business needs, and just because the sheer labor is still much cheaper. You don't see these super inflated AI salaries. I mean, they are very high for China, but they're in the several million RMB range, not the $100 million USD range that you see in Silicon Valley. A lot of the deployments are going on in a more customized way, right? So not necessarily being done by companies, um, AI startups, but being done by consulting firms, being done by internal teams primarily using open source. And so a much lower level of revenue spend, but nonetheless being, the technology is being disseminated throughout the industry.
Yeah, fascinating. And Ray, while we have you, I wanted to widen the aperture to investment sentiment a little bit. A few years ago, peak China was the dominant narrative here in the United States in the English language media. Much of that has faded away, I think, amid this, excitement around Chinese AI, biotech, the so-called DeepSeek moment, right? But how durable do you think is this shift in sentiment? And how do you reconcile the tech euphoria, if you will, with a still very soft macro picture and very uneven employment data in China's macroeconomy?
Yeah. Well, I think like the macro and, venture or emerging technologies are always somewhat disconnected. I feel the same way in Silicon Valley, right? You have so much unemployment all around me. And then yet you have these, I don't know, 10-person AI companies that are getting unicorn valuations and people with really, really significant pay packages also in the same area, right? Because it's just, right, it depends on what aspect of tech that you're working in. Um, so it's really the same for China. I don't really see that as being conflicting. Um, I do think that for AI, you know, we're not yet at the point that um, it is being able to displace like large areas of employment yet. It is still, productivity boost. The potential of the many companies we visited, the one that many people think could be problematic is autonomous driving. But the government is taking their time in rolling out the licenses for that. So I don't think it'll be, just like in the US, there's so many safety concerns that it won't probably be, you know, so impactful in the short term. Um, in terms of just broader investment, um, again, if you compare to 2023, 2024, there is much more interest from foreign investors in China tech. But the reality of it is that a lot of this movement that we're seeing that Paul mentioned, CamberCon, right? I think was the best performing stock in China tech last year or something, is still pretty effectively closed to foreign investors because it's on the domestic capital markets. So as we see more and more people do secondary listings in Hong Kong, or even some considering primary listings, there might be more interest there, and because just the ease of access, but I still think the interest is quite muted. I see a little bit more interest from emerging economies. Um, and that's just part because TechBuzz China has a lot of emerging market subscribers where they're looking at Chinese AI and robotics, and they're saying, hey, that's a much cheaper solution that I could actually deploy in my local market. And it is advanced enough, I don't have maybe the homegrown technology that it might make sense for me to figure out how to deploy it in my home market, maybe in the form of some tech transfer or joint ventures. But that stuff is still very new. I would say there are only very few forward-thinking, enterprising investors and people with capital that are looking at that.
Yeah, and I would just quickly add, I think that the U.S.-China, if we get to a U.S.-China trade deal, and we get to some further clarity around what types of investments can go both ways, which we're sort of in a crazy situation now. And potentially if the U.S. The trade deal includes Chinese investment in the U.S. and things like batteries and EVs, I think the investment climate's could change. I mean, just in the last few days, we've seen a tremendous uptick in some of the ADRs, the Chinese ADRs in the U.S. Tremendous interest in companies like NIO and XPeng and some of the higher quality companies that are listed in the U.S. And I agree totally with Ray. I mean, and there's a big push to do these listings in Hong Kong. I think a lot of Chinese semiconductor companies, for example, SI Carrier comes to mind. There may be a series of pretty high quality listings in Hong Kong over the next some number of months. There's been a big uptick in U.S. listings too of Chinese companies, and so all that is sort of I agree that there's still a lot of reticence on the part of some investors, but I think if we get a deal, the general climate around U.S. China improves somewhat, or at least stabilizes. That investment climate could change, and then depending on what sort of structural changes that the Chinese government makes, there's been a lot of talk about improvements in support for the private sector in China, et cetera. some real concrete progress on some of those areas that have been long the concern of both U.S. businesses operating in China and Chinese private sector companies operating in China, then I think we could be in a year from now, we could be in a different investment environment that's better.
Fantastic. It's always a little dangerous to me to predict what's going to happen in U.S.-China
Yeah,
trade negotiations.
All bets are off. It could go down completely the other way, you know, if we have, everything falls apart in the
Yeah.
next few months, right?
Yeah, but I mean,
issue that important caveat.
Sure, but I mean, to
I
close,
tend to want to be optimistic. But, yeah.
me too, to be fair. But I mean, to close, I do want to get quick predictions from each of you, maybe 1 minute apiece. Can you please identify the domain where you believe the next DeepSeek-style breakthrough from China is most likely to emerge? And we're going to hold you accountable to that and see who's the closest, maybe 1 year from now. So I'm going to start with Selina.
Yeah, I think, I mean, one is biotech, which a lot of people have been predicting for some time. And I think if the biotech chat GPT moment happens, it'll be in China first instead of the US. That is my sense. Robotics, a lot of the robotics founders we talked to said they believe multimodality will get them to the chat GPT moment instead of through like VLA or VLM. So that I think will probably take another like 2-3 years to see more, like advancements in that area. But if that prediction is true, and that's what some robotic startups are pursuing, including like Unitree and his founder, like Wang Xingxing, has talked about that publicly and believing that multimodality will be the software breakthrough that they need, then that is another DeepSeek moment that we'll see. Yeah, I think those are the two main things.
Fantastic. And Ray, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Well, I think Selina mentioned those the ones I might have said. Oh, I was probably going to say biotech. I think that and I've said this publicly too, by the way, and in other publications. So I guess if I had to pick um something just for the sake of being different and only because I'm actively trying to find some of these companies to visit, and there seems to be some progress, is probably BCI. Um, but it's so early, and the US and China are kind of like, it's just such an early industry, and it is hard to see who's making real progress in either country, aside from Neuralink. I think there's very little information on how everyone else is doing that. It's a question mark, but I'll just put it out there just to be interesting.
Fantastic. And Paul, finally to you.
Cool. I have two. I will agree with Selina on the robotics. I was really blown away by, for example, one of the companies we met in Shanghai doing sensory hand work, which was really blew me away. I want to invest in them too. But they were developing sort of skin for humanoid robotics, and I think that coupled with particularly VLA. And all the work that's going on into that. We also met with some other companies that were working on sort of the brains of humanoid robots. I think when all that comes together, that's going to be a game changer. The second one is science. I think that if you look at what the work that's happening at Shanghai AI Lab, they're focusing on getting to AGI through science verticals. So integrating across science verticals, sort of like what DeepMind did. With AlphaFold, and that's sort of the way to get to AGI. And so I think in China we're going to get a breakthrough in some areas of like pure science, and where things like new materials and new approaches to, including in the medical space, to new drugs and other things. That may be a DeepSeek like moment when Chinese companies are starting to come up with really new and innovative things that really put China and Chinese companies on par with companies like DeepMind, which have pioneered the use of AI in these really critical areas for science that end up having these huge downstream consequences. But they're sort of fundamental science that enables, at the end of the day, other commercial and those kinds of gains. And I think there's a lot of effort going into that in China.
That's a really good one. Yeah. We did meet a startup doing that, but yeah. They're very early.
Yeah, but fantastic. I mean, thank you, Ray. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Selina, for such a rich discussion. I learned a lot. And, thank you to our audience for joining us today for this fascinating conversation. To keep up with future episodes of China's DeepSeek Moments, please subscribe to updates from Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis. I am Lizzi Li, and we will see you next time.